For years now, people have been talking about the input delay in Extreme Versus, and I was really curious to see what was going on, so I decided to get a slow motion camera, wire up an LED to my fight stick, and do some testing. At first I decided to use the slow motion mode on my phone, but it didn't really work out. 8x speed is really not slow enough to see exactly what's going on. So I went on eBay and got a junked up 1000 FPS camera that can slow it down 40 times. So you can see this small red LED here. What'll happen is as soon as I hit the button, it will turn off. And when it turns off, we'll start timing it. As soon as the animation begins, we'll stop that timer. And with that time, we'll divide it by 40, which in this case gives us 150 milliseconds, which is the actual amount of time in real time that it took between button press and the animation to begin. We'll then subtract 15, which is the amount of latency my setup has, my monitor and my fight stick. That will give us the time the game took between button press and animation to begin. And we divide that by 16.6, which is 1 frame at 60 frames per second, which may sound kind of complicated, but essentially it means it took 8 frames for the game to start the animation after the button was pressed. This should, more often than not, give us the exact amount of frames it took. However, sometimes we will get 1 frame off, but it really shouldn't be more than that. The number should be either the exact amount of frames or 1 frame off, though like I said, usually it will be correct. During the 240 FPS testing I did on my phone, I noticed that suits would have varying amounts of pre-animation delay, and that was giving me different numbers. So the first test I wanted to do was test multiple suits in free battle and see what kind of numbers I got. Most of the tests haven't been put in this video because I did a lot of testing, and these clips are pretty lengthy already, and I really didn't want to make a 30-minute video about a fairly simple subject. I think it's most likely that what I saw during the 240 FPS testing was an error due to it not being slowed down enough. And I really didn't see anything other than 7 or 8 frames throughout the dozen or so suits I tested, and I really doubt any of the other suits are going to have a difference. Testing Neutral C was definitely the easiest, but I was a bit worried that it was going to be slower than other moves. So I talked to a few people and decided to test some of the faster moves in the game. And we still see 7 or 8, as you'll see here. I think it's safe to say that Maxiboost On will give you 7 or 8 frames of latency based on polling and a few other factors. At this point, I was curious to see how it stacked up against the other Extreme Versus games. So this next set of testing will be Gundam Versus, Full Boost, and Extreme Versus Vanilla, all in free battle. So as you can see, other than Gundam Versus that has significantly more latency than the other games, they're all pretty similar. So far all the testing has been in offline mode, free battle specifically, but now we're going to take a look at online input latency. Now I did a lot of online input latency testing, but I'm just going to show small portions again for the sake of brevity. So the first test I'm going to show here is with my console on Wi-Fi. Now this is the worst example I found before the game became stuttery. And as you'll see, we get 17 frames of input latency. This should really convince you to connect a wire to your console if at all possible, because this is definitely something you will run into if you are playing on Wi-Fi. Now this next test is the best case scenario I found with Wi-Fi, and it's almost certain that this number was jumping around quite a bit during this match, so you really can't take this at face value. Now that I've got Wi-Fi bad out of the way, let's take a look at the numbers you'll actually be seeing in-game with a wired connection. And interestingly, that number is almost always going to be 9. If you're playing in a room where everyone lives close to you, you might see 8 on occasion, although I never saw 8. 10 and 11 frames did show up on occasion when everyone was using wired connection, although it was almost always 9, and that's playing with people over 2,000 miles away from me. And it really didn't matter. Sometimes I would get 9 in yellow bar connection, and sometimes I would get 9 in blue connection. And I think that mostly has to do with those 7 or 8 frames. I think that they're being used to kind of absorb some of the latency. Otherwise, how would I get 8 frames offline and 9 frames in yellow bar connection playing with multiple people over 2,000 miles away from me? So in summary, if you're playing on a clean wired connection with other players on clean wired connections, you'll see roughly 150 milliseconds of latency, or 9 frames. Now, that can vary a bit, but that's generally what you're going to see. And it's really going to depend on your personal reaction time on how big of a problem that is. I think for most people, it should be just low enough to where it doesn't become a big issue. Thanks for watching. It was a lot of fun making this video, even if it was a lot more work than I expected it to be. I'm going to be linking some regional and community discords in the description if you want to check them out and maybe get some help learning the game or find people to play with.